In the case of Ukraine, which comes first, NATO or EU?
It has to be NATO.
Are you afraid of nuclear war? Or?
Well, it depends what you look at it. Do you think he's real on that? I've never thought that is a real threat because the consequences would be so enormous.
This is Vladimir Putin.
He came over on a state visit. As leader of the opposition, I did actually, you then are entitled to a one-on-one meeting with visiting dignitaries. So I was called in to see him. I was a little more cynical because I always think once KGB, always KGB.
But you had Russian state TV literally saying they're going to hit Western capitals, listed London specifically.
Of course it is, yeah. Well,
yes.
You know, there's what you say and what you do are often two things different. So this whole business of the peace is how do you do it without having to put your boots on the ground?
What would it take to get UK boots on the ground in Ukraine?
If they will finish this job, they need the tools.
I'm Audrey McAlpine with United 24 Media here in Kyiv, and today we have a very special guest with us, Sir Iain Duncan Smith. Iain, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Audrey, my pleasure.
And I'm going to ask you about why the heck you're here in Kyiv, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about your past and your sort of CV, if you will. I might take a deep breath because it's quite expansive.
Yeah, I may well take a runner at this stage, but anyway, go on.
You were the former leader of the Conservative Party.
Yep.
You spent over 3 decades in Parliament.
Ouch.
And counting, yes. You were a member of David Cameron's cabinet as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. You're also personally sanctioned by China.
Indeed.
And you were the Shadow Secretary of State for Defense and Social Security during your time in opposition.
I was. And
you were a former lieutenant in the British Army.
We call it lieutenant, but we're not going to quibble about that
American,
aspect.
Yes, excuse me.
I was actually a captain at the end, so rose to the dizzy ranks of captain.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. And then you served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles.
I did. And in Rhodesia when we were trying to bring the Patriotic Front in to end the war. But got a bit hairy at times, but it was interesting.
And you were working as an aide to the Major General. Is that right at the time?
Yeah, General John Ackland. I worked as sort of slightly two elements, ADC and also liaison and what they call a military assistant as well. It was a very interesting period going all around what was then Rhodesia, is now Zimbabwe, trying to keep the peace and keep all these armed characters inside these camps when all we had was tiny numbers of Commonwealth troops, mostly British, knowing that they could be torn to shreds if anything went wrong at any moment. So it was always an interesting balancing act. Taught me a lot about politics.
And how old were you then?
This is a hard one. I can't remember. I think it was something like, that must have been about 24, 25.
24, 25.
Probably, I think, yeah.
Okay, so you've been involved in peacekeeping, general global politics since you were a young man.
Yes, yeah. Northern Ireland was a funny kind of thing. To be peacekeeping inside your own country is peculiar, to be the army on the ground. So it had its restrictions. I lost a good friend while I was there, so it was a real nasty old war. We lost over 1,000 servicemen in Northern Ireland, which is often forgotten about.
Well, we're going to get into why you're here in Kyiv with us right now.
Indeed.
But first, I'm going to ask you a couple of sort of just, the pressing topics of the day, just a bit of either or, and you just choose which one comes to mind. Okay?
Okay.
Are you ready?
Ready.
Tottenham or Arsenal?
Tottenham.
Fish and chips or chicken Kyiv?
Fish and chips.
The Queen or the band Queen?
The King.
The late Queen or the band Queen?
Oh, always the late Queen, wonderful one.
North Sea or Black Sea?
Well, North Sea and Black Sea united, I think.
Okay. London or Kyiv?
Well, I've come to like Kyiv, so quickfire would be, I know London, but Kyiv's growing on me.
And this is how many times have you been to Kyiv?
Third time, I think.
Third time to Kyiv.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Challenger tank or Abrams tank?
Challenger.
I see. It makes sense. I won't take offense. Churchill or Thatcher? Tough
Both.
one. Both.
They're both remarkable people. Bestrode their time in office like Colossus. And she was no exception to that. Remarkable woman. I got to know her quite well.
For Ukraine, in the case of Ukraine, which comes first, NATO or EU?
It has to be NATO. But EU is important in this future development.
And yes or no, peace through strength?
Always. And you cannot have peace without justice. A peace without justice is an unstable peace that will end quickly. And therefore, that's what I say to any legislator. Don't ask for peace. You need to have peace with justice.
Fabulous. I think most Ukrainians would also echo that sentiment. So we talked a little bit about your past. We've talked now about how you feel about some of the pressing issues of this day. But I want to know about some of the people that you've met through your time in politics. And I have one person I'm very curious about, and you have some explaining to do with this one.
Yes. He came over on a state visit, I think.
And this is, just so you know, this is Vladimir Putin?
Yes, Vladimir Putin
and
came
what year
over.
was this?
He was quite new into post at that stage. I mean, he hadn't been around a long time, and there was lots of potential promise. We were told about how he would be okay. But I, as leader of the opposition, I did actually, you then are entitled to a one-on-one meeting with visiting dignitaries.
Really?
So I was called in to see him. I must have gone to the state banquet if there was a state banquet later. Getting into that terribly starched stuff. But I've just, the photograph now brings it back to me. Actually, he was quite evasive during the discussion, I have to tell you. You couldn't really tie him down, but he had a set of lines that he obviously thought would satisfy sort of democracies and things, and he trotted those out. But it was early on. There was no indication at that stage of where we were going with this.
And was he speaking in English?
Well, I think he must have done, because my Russian is non-existent. So either we're just smiling at each other for an hour, or somebody was speaking in a language you can understand. I thought there was a translator there. But I when you showed me this picture, I thought, where's the translator? But I think that may have been a posed picture just at the end. But I think there was someone translating at the time.
And do you remember what you discussed at this time?
Oh, it was global. It was to do with where he saw Russia and what the issue was around the European Union and that sort of thing. So it was good. We talked a little bit about the Second World War, funny enough, because
did you?
I've always been interested in what happened there in the Eastern Front, and I've done a bit of studying of it. So there was an interesting sort of exchange at that point.
I mean, George Bush, when he met him, said, there's this famous quote where he said, I looked into his eyes and I saw a soul, or something like this. I mean, what was your sort of...
Yeah, I had a meeting with George Bush later, after having met him, and he said much the same to me. He talked about this story that Putin had given to George Bush, which was about this dacha that he had and how it had burnt down, and it was his mother's, and how in the ashes he discovered the crucifix there, which he cherished. And George Bush said, he thinks he could, could do business with him at that stage. And that was quite early on. I was a little more cynical because I always think once KGB, always KGB. But he was very smooth and very, very, he sang all the right tunes at that stage and didn't sound in the slightest bit threatening. But I did have a feeling that there was some menace there.
I think the Brits in general have been more discerning when it comes to Russia. I think Americans, we have this, I don't know, maybe naivety when it comes to Russia that the Brits don't quite have.
I think it was more a case of wanting it to be so. So it was the triumph of hope over experience. And I tend to be a little more cynical in these sort of meetings and take the view that somebody has to prove that the hope exists rather than you just laying your policy around hope. Better always to go with experience. So people really were hopeful then. I mean, this was quite early on, as you said. And people were thinking that post-Soviet Union, this could be this new leader, that we could have good relations with Russia. So there was no indication really at this point, you didn't feel. Well, you remember he was coming in at a time when there'd been quite a lot of chaos. Post the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War was over. Then there was a certain amount of chaos. Russia got into economic difficulty. Then he arrives under the new constitution. So there was generally across the West a hope that this would set out a new era where Russia would embrace the concept of the free market and of the rule of law. And that was, it's not, I think, in politics, you have to have something to aim for, some hope in some way for a better world. But you need to temper that at times with just experience about what people have done in the past, sometimes a good rule about where they might go. He had said in the past that he was angry about the settlement and the way that Russia had been treated and the independence movements taking place in all those states that were once the Soviet Union. So there was a certain amount of evidence that he wasn't quite what we hoped he would be. But as I say, you needed to look into the crystal ball, and people couldn't see it.
Sure. Now, when we introduced you today, I introduced you as Sir Iain Duncan Smith, which means that you are a knight.
Yes, a knight of the realm.
A knight of the realm.
Yes.
And this is our next picture here. Oh, no, not this one. This one.
Yes.
Is this you becoming a knight of the realm?
Officially, yes, although I was earlier on, but this is the ceremony that the king, or would have been the queen when I first got knighted. But COVID meant that we were delayed for about a year and a half, nearly 2 years before we actually were allowed to go in.
Is that so? So this was during COVID?
No, this is after COVID. This
after
is
COVID.
When they were now catching up. And this is rather nicely in Windsor Castle, which is a much nicer place to go than Buckingham Palace. We had a little conversation on the side. Well, it's a little bit, all the rooms are just a little bit smaller, which is nicer. And it's got a sort of, it's got a warmer feel to it, I think, sometimes than Buckingham Palace has, which is grander. But Windsor Castle's got all the history, of course.
And so you've met both King Charles, of course, here, and you've met the Queen, I imagine.
I did on a number of occasions. When I first became leader of the opposition, you had to go through. I was made a Privy Councillor I hadn't been in government prior to that. So I had to become a Privy Councillor, which is you swear an oath of allegiance to her as a person, as opposed to the allegiance that we have to the Crown in general. You swear it to her to uphold and protect her. And then you have to kiss her ring.
Kiss the ring, quite literally.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you become a member of the Privy Council, so you swear a separate oath. So I'd met her on a number of occasions. I met him in the course of my time as leader and also subsequently when I was Secretary of State.
And then you've met another sort of queen, or at least among conservatives, she's quite a queen, and that's Miss Thatcher. And she endorsed you, did she not?
She always had impeccable judgment. What can I say? I wouldn't deny it.
No, of course not.
She was great, though. Remarkable woman. Even then, when she was getting on a bit and suffering a few things,
What's going on in this picture here? You guys, are you playing billiards?
She joined us for the shadow cabinet meeting.
Okay.
William Hague was leader, and she came to join us for a period, which was great. I seem to recall she had all the actually, no, it wasn't. It was all the previous leaders of the Conservative Party, and David Cameron was the last one, became Prime Minister. And she was amusing and forthright. And I can retail one story that she told to somebody about the Maastricht Treaty when we were busy voting for or against it. I was rebelling at that time, not long after I came into politics.
You rebelling, this
was one of many, let's be fair. And she said to somebody who was very close to her, when he had said he couldn't make his mind up, she withered him with a remark that said, "The trouble with you," she said, "is that your spine doesn't meet your brain."
Ooh.
I know, he left 2.5 inches
insult.
high. It was a very strong insult. She could be like that if she disagreed with you.
Was she ever like that with you? In private or
No, I don't
public?
remember her get quite so withering, but there were times when she didn't agree with you and she would tell you straight off. She didn't believe in wasting time in niceties, which made her a really rather remarkable and a very good person to have in a room. And she would very quickly get to the nub of the issue, very quickly. She had a very, very keen eye for detail. I mean, there were legion of stories that they would have a box for her in the evening, and she would be quite full with lots of papers from different cabinet ministers, etc., which is normal for a prime minister. And what would come back would be this spidery handwriting in red ink with bits crossed out. And if you then went in to see her afterwards about the paper you brought forward,
yes, she
would tear it apart with you. She would know every single facet of it. She would not have forgotten a single sentence or a paragraph. If you didn't know what was written there, she would literally tear you apart. Ooh. So, but if you stood your ground and you knew your subject, then you got her approval. She was remarkable in that sense. She didn't dwell on niceties or small talk.
She didn't mince words. It doesn't.
Not really. No, she
knew her stuff.
A remarkable woman in many senses. And first of all, to be a woman as a leader of probably the oldest political party in the West, Western world, and one that had a deep history, for her to be the first woman prime minister of one of the significant states in the world was really quite an achievement for her.
Yeah.
And to stay there for that time, you have to admire her in many, many ways.
So you've worked with a couple different leaders here,
Yeah.
including who in Ukraine is quite big, Mr. Boris. You guys have worked obviously very closely together. This is you guys in Chingford.
This is during the election, which was a horrible election because it was literally in November, December, and it was freezing cold, really wet. And Boris was en route somewhere else. And I said, do me a favor, Boris, come and just glad hand my supporters, because they've been out on the road knocking on doors and seeing people, and they'd love to see you. Yeah. And he said he would. And then there was a huge turnout. I'm actually, as you can see, dressed in what I call my campaigning kit.
Very smart.
He's dressing in his, my shirt will hang out in a second suit kit, as it were.
Why do you think, because people in the UK feel some ways about him, but people here love Boris? I mean...
Well, Boris was very good at making big decisions and making them quickly. So he was very quick onto the Ukraine issue, and the first significant country to say, we're going to support you. And that then led to others following suit, because there was some hesitation, I think. But Boris was very quick. And on those things, he was very good. But there are other issues, and then COVID didn't help him because of I think people now got it completely messed up, really. Yes, he made mistakes about meetings in Downing Street and everything else, but I sometimes think, would another country have focused on that so much, or as whether we got this policy right and wrong? I mean, shutting down the economy turns out to have been an absolute disaster for the free world. And I was one of those, I'm afraid, that was arguing that at the time. But Boris was beset by scientists who kept telling him it's a matter of science. Of course, it turns out it was not. Locking down didn't change anything. Sweden showed that you didn't have to lock the whole of society down.
Sure.
And they had very good figures at the end of it. So there was this constant rolling debate, but nobody really knew anything. What they did was they just kind of assumed it. So lots of scientists didn't agree, but, that was where he was. So all of that was a difficult time for him to having come in at a big election victory to get us finally out of get Brexit done. And then he's hit by this. So, that dominated his prime ministership.
It's interesting, though, because people forget what those early days are like, either whether it's early COVID or early, Ukraine war, because thinking back to when Russia first invaded, Zelensky basically appealed to all European governments, but just through Zoom or Skype, he sort of teleprompted himself into there. Were you in those early addresses of Zelensky's?
Yes, he did the first ever online address to the British Parliament. Never in its history has it ever done that, or allowed it to happen. Everybody had to be in. And by the way, they would never have been allowed to be in the chamber of the House of Commons. It would normally be done in one of the great halls, Westminster Hall or something. So it was a first on a number of levels. It was packed. And we did something else which we don't normally do, which is people applauded at the end of it, which you don't do in the chamber of the House of Commons. You wave your order paper, or shout here, or whatever it is, but
interesting.
You don't clap in the House of Commons, and sometimes people do, and they're frowned upon for it, and they won't do it twice.
And he said this in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets. He quoted Churchill there, and you're kind of a big Churchill guy. So did that go over well? You think that was like a winning move?
Well, I think Churchill and 1940 inspired him.
Sure. So
Churchill's language is always memorable because he had a fantastic understanding of the English language, and he used it. And I think Zelensky chose to use the sentiment of that as a way of motivating his troops. And so we forget that for Ukraine at that period, it was touch and go whether Russia actually took Kyiv and then took Ukraine. But luckily, and because of the strength and fortitude of the Ukrainian people, they did not. And they're still in this beastly war now, 3 years, and thousands upon thousands of people killed, all because of the ambitions of one man in Russia. All of that. But so it's been, at that stage, Zelensky was everywhere. The trouble is now that the West has a very poor ability to summon important memories. And so it isn't always on the news. And the public doesn't understand it, and the cost of living crisis that followed made one or two people question all of it. I mean, the truth about the UK is the UK political parties are united as one. There is not a piece of paper between us. This government will follow the same policy as the last government and vice versa. And I'm here in Ukraine with a member of the Labour Party and came out with a member of the Liberal Democrats to show that we have cross-party support.
And you always do that. You've done that on all your trips out here.
Yeah, I think it's important for me to bring people out and to get them to understand the nature of what's going on here, which is important, and then also to express their support for this really difficult situation that Ukraine is in. I think we could do a lot more to help Ukraine. We've been hesitant. We've been slow-footed. Countries in Europe have had assumed wrongly, Mrs. Merkel and co., that there would never be another war in Europe, and it's been a disastrous policy as a result. You know, becoming dependent on Russia for oil and gas was outrageous, really, should never have happened. And then Nord Stream 2, the pipeline they were going to build to bypass Eastern Europe. I mean, what a betrayal that would have been to those brave countries on the border who were supporting Ukraine at the time. All of this just was being bulldozed through by her.
Yeah.
And none of the other countries felt strong enough to stand up to her and say, this is an outrage, because they all wanted the oil as well and gas. And that's the problem that we faced. So there's been a lot of humble pie, as they say, being eaten in the councils of Europe, but not enough, I think.
What does it take, though, to get these sort of policies passed? What's going on in the back corridors of Parliament when you're talking about stuff like this?
Stability and courage.
Yeah.
And stability isn't always there in politics, as you know. Germany's had now a chaotic political time since Mrs. Merkel went.
What do you think of the Chancellor?
Germany?
Yes.
I think he's had an impossible position, to be honest with you, because he didn't hold a majority and it's been a coalition. Now, I know coalitions are formed a lot in Europe, but this was an unstable one, I think. And, it's going to be difficult to see where it goes. But Germany is a vitally important component, A, because of the money, although they're in worse times than they were before. But importantly, because you need Germany to step up on equipment. And they were quite slow, and they've been quite restrictive on usage of some of their weapons. The little countries have been much bolder, Denmark and others. They've stepped up like, bold people and delivered support to Ukraine. The UK has done so, but the UK itself had, I'm afraid, cut its defense budgets over years. So it's trying to build that back up now in a difficult economic period, as are the other countries. So it's, Europe should be able to do the lion's share of the heavy lifting because America, as we know, has focus elsewhere and thinks that Europe ought to do more. Europe does now do more than America does in monetary terms, certainly.
Does it?
It does. But America is the only country on earth that has the military capability. That is what really Ukraine needs. And it's that bit which sent me to Washington a year ago in December to persuade them to pass the bill, the Republicans to vote for it, which we did.
Wow.
Well,
so you're working in the UK and you're working in the US
yes,
to get
I set up a
support.
global organization called the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, so I'm constantly involved talking to people. We have parliamentarians in 40 countries now in support of us, worried about the rise of China, which I'm sure we may get onto, but we may not.
Now, in terms of, we're talking about weapons, I mean, long-range weapons, that was a huge discussion in the fall. And I believe that the UK sort of gave the green light for them to use these long-range weapons to strike within Russia. Is that the case? What did that look like? What were discussions like?
Well, I think it was a huge mistake on President Biden's part to not allow ATACMS, which is their long-range missile, to be used outside of the borders of Ukraine. And it's like asking a boxer to go into the ring when already the other boxer is that bit bigger than you, but with one arm tied behind their back in the hope that nobody notices. And that is exactly what fearful countries in the West, particularly America, did to Ukraine. So in a critical period in the first 2 years, Ukraine should have and could have been much, much stronger. And that was a period when he really wanted to knock Russia back because Russia had stumbled in its first period of invasion. And Ukraine just didn't get the weapons and wasn't allowed to use them in the way that they would have done. I mean, people say, well, what the hell does a missile matter? I said, it matters because you attack the supply depots that lie behind the lines. And as somebody who had been in the army before, you know that the key to the front line is they use up an awful lot of munitions. They need food. They need constant resupply. So if you push their depots further and further away from the front line, then it makes it longer and harder and opens up the supply lines to other attack. So it's strategically vital that you don't let them get away with very, very close supply lines, which are mostly just on the border or outside of Ukraine. And that's critical. So not being able to do that has meant that Russia's always been able to supply its troops very much quicker than Ukraine does.
And did people in Parliament understand that in the early days? I mean, of course, again, we have to reimagine ourselves back in those times. But, you know, at the very beginning, people were just giving helmets. And then there was a big thing about giving tanks and so on and so forth. I mean, do you think people in Parliament understood the necessity of giving long-range weapons? Or do you think that it was just politics?
Some did. You have an understanding of these things in military terms. But the key thing was there's that lovely speech, talking about Churchill earlier on. Churchill gets his wonderful letter in 1941 before America joins the war and Roosevelt's trying to get them across the line, but they don't want to come in. And he writes a letter to Churchill by hand, which he gives to his recent opponent. I think the third time he was elected, and he gives it to him who's come across to London during the war. And it's got a lovely handwritten quote from Longfellow's poem, which is about the building of the state, which calls the Union. And that was interesting because he basically, at the end of that speech, his message back to Roosevelt was, give us the tools and we will finish the job. And he was desperate for equipment. We were running out, factories were being bombed all the time, a bit like Ukraine is at the moment. And that message led to the Lease Lend Act, in which America started shipping sort of destroyers, although they weren't the greatest destroyers in the world, it has to be said, and they were probably going to the knacker's yard directly afterwards, but we managed to get them up. So the convoys. And all of that was really the key, and it did help dramatically at that key moment. So that is the message, really, that Ukraine has constantly needed to send to the West. But it is the UK that has championed that message, I think. But America has found it difficult at times to figure out how to do that. So my question really is, we need to make sure that we give Ukraine the tools. If they will finish this job, they need the tools.
And that's coming from someone who has a military background. And this is not just you who was in the military, but also, I believe, your father.
Oh, God, yeah.
So what's going on here in this picture?
Well, he was commanding, I think, at this particular point, 64 Squadron, which was equipped with Spitfires. He was a Spitfire pilot all the way through.
In World War II.
Very highly decorated, 5 gallantry medals, that sort of thing. And this is him just going, as they were being scrambled because of some enemy activity. He was just in the northern part of London, a place called Hornchurch. And he had a little Cocker Spaniel called Vicky. It was a boy, but it was called Vicky. And it used to sit at the dispersal when his aircraft took off. And
is that dangerous for a dog?
No, because it was on the bank as it taxied.
Okay.
And then it would sit there. After he'd gone, it would sit there and wait till he came back. And the interesting thing was all the engineers, etc., would say it would stay as other aircraft came into the circuit and landed until he came into the circuit, could hear his engine slightly different. For some reason, we could do that. He would get up and trot down to where it would park and wait for him. So the last thing that he did as he left was the guy always brought his dog to him, shut the cockpit, and off he goes into combat. And then when he came back, the first thing that he did was grab the dog and give it a stroke. And that was that photograph, really, which has explained it. But he was a phenomenal fighter pilot and a phenomenal war leader. I mean, really quite remarkable, commanding 1,000 men when he was 24, 25 years old. I mean, I don't know what I was doing then, but it certainly wasn't
I think
in combat most of the war.
Well, you were doing something similar. This is you in Germany, but it's during the Troubles. Is that right?
Yes. The medal I've got on my chest at that point is the Northern Ireland. Well, it's the General Service Medal. We're very mean with medals in the British Army.
Mean with medals? What does that mean?
Well, they have a General Service Medal, which is just a little clasp of where you were serving.
Okay, I see.
Whereas I know in America, they hand you out medals by the yard to denote where you are. It's always,
shots fired.
No. Well, I just remarked that the British Ministry of Defence has always been pretty mean with medals, but that had a clasp on it for Northern Ireland because we'd just come back and we were getting, it was me, I'd just marched the old colours off parade and we were being...
marched the old colours off. You translate that into
regiments
American
have
English.
Their colours. The colours are your, in the old days when, like Waterloo and things like that, the colours before the battle would be paraded in front of, that's why, by the way, trooping of the colour, that's what would have happened the morning before Waterloo. They'd have marched the colours past everybody so they could see them to know that is your rallying point.
I see.
So they had a very specific job in the old days, but they have all the battle honours that you fought stitched into the colours. So they are very critical. And to lose the colours was a cardinal sin in the old days. It was the breaking of the regiment. So the colours would be defended to the death. So there was always a very explicit ceremony when they became a bit too worn that they would be marched off and new ones would be presented and they'd be blessed and that. So I had the one job of rather sadly marching the colours off.
Wow.
And then I left the parade and stood there and my father happened to take that picture of me, which I only saw the other day, funny enough.
Oh,
yeah.
It must have been a proud moment, though.
Well, it was, certainly it's a sort of historical thing, really, when you think you're part of a regiment that was first started in the 17th century. So.
I'd say, my country's not even that old, really. Jesus. And then, so you go from the Troubles and then this is you looking very cool.
That's Rhodesia.
Yes.
Or Zimbabwe, as it now is.
What's this belt? What's the colors there? What's
those are called the household division colors. So all the guards regiments and the cavalry included, but certainly the foot guards, as they're called. So you'd have Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Welsh Guards, Irish Guards.
You were Scots Guards.
I was Scots Guards. And they all shared that same belt of colours. Now, if you look at it carefully, that belt is, in fact, people will recognise it as it's the saddle belt, really. So if you put a saddle on a horse, it has this double strap, which you then tie to keep the saddle tight. So Queen Victoria had those colours for her racing team.
Okay.
And when the guards said, we need colours,
yes,
she said, you have my racing colours.
Very generous of her.
Unique. And so that's why the belt has two straps.
It's almost like the color of your tie right now.
That is, in fact, a guard's tie.
Is it?
It's the only one I brought with me, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. So that would be known as the guard's tie. Those are the guard's colours. And you would wear them, times like that if you were in fatigues, or that, in fact, was the remaining jungle colours that we use. That's long since not in service, but we wore those while we were out there. The Commonwealth Force went out there to bring the Lancaster House Agreement in, which was the settlement on Rhodesia that became Zimbabwe. It's such a stunningly beautiful country, and it's sad to see the state that it's in today because it used to be the breadbasket of southern Africa and produced phenomenal amounts of food, but it doesn't do that anymore because the farms have been devastated, which is a pity.
And you were overseeing peacekeepers there as well, right?
We had peacekeepers, and the trick was, as we brought the Patriotic Front in, various two different types. One camp I went to that had some Irish Guardsmen in it. They had 50 Irish Guardsmen, and there were 5,000 Patriotic Front, all armed to the teeth in the camps. So
tense.
It would have been tense, and they had to be paraded every day, and they had to check where they'd left. But quite interestingly, the commander of the Irish Guards detachment realized very quickly that that they couldn't stop anything happening by force. So he took all the weapons off his troops and locked them up. And he said, the only way we will survive here is if we make friends with those here and they trust us, which is what they duly did. And they walked around without weapons, which was a big surprise.
Interesting.
To the Patriotic Front, who couldn't understand that because the only people they'd seen at that stage, would have been Rhodesian forces who would have been carrying weapons. So that I thought it rather marked out how the British would think of something like that, to do that like that, because the threat then gets diminished and you have to hope and rely that you succeed in your, which they duly did. But it was, there were one or two hairy moments, as they say.
I mean, thinking about how peace was achieved there, what do you think about looking at Ukraine and Russia? There's talks, Zelensky was just at Davos recently and said that, you know, Ukraine would need something like 200,000 peacekeepers from Europe if they were to go down that route. What do you think?
Well, I think sometimes we try and get the cart before the horse. I mean, the fact is you don't have peace. And what would that peace consist of? Would it be an imposed peace? You know, the important thing is to figure out that point that I made earlier on. Is there any settlement that would give Ukraine peace with justice? Or is it going to be just a conventional, easy thing to do by bullying them into some kind of peace, which isn't a peace? I mean, after all, you know, I think it was France and Germany, Merkel and Macron, who kind of pushed Ukraine to settle on Crimea, if you remember, and
yes.
in 2014, and that was a disaster because all it did was teach Putin and President Xi in China and others that the West is not prepared to stay the course on anything, and therefore they just want any kind of peace. So they had that territory taken off them, which was part of their sovereign right. So, and what happens? He's back again quite soon to take the whole of the country. So weakness like that and a bad settlement is never a good thing to have involved yourselves in.
And the West seems to continually sort of fall for this from Putin. I mean, even talking about something like nuclear blackmailing. I mean, he constantly uses that to slow down Western aid and to sort of scare people back into place. Do you think that that's real? Are you afraid of nuclear war? Or?
Well, it depends what you look at it. Do you think he's real on that? I've never thought that is a real threat because the consequences would be so enormous that it's not in the interests of Russia.
You had Russian state TV literally saying they're going to hit Western capitals, listed London specifically.
Of course it is, yeah. Well,
yes.
You know, there's what you say and what you do are often two things different. The only point I'd make about that is that the problem for the free world is that they're democracies, and democracies have a seriously difficult time trying to persuade people that there is justice and reason in being tough in areas which may lead to some kind of military action. So this whole business of the peace is how do you do it without having to put your boots on the ground to make a difference? And I think that's what's been going on. The threats of nuclear war, I don't think were really taken seriously. And it's ironic, really, because Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons as part of an agreement, which, by the way, one of the guarantors was the United Kingdom. But those guarantees have stood for nothing when the war came, because Putin postures with his nuclear weapons, but you could have argued that he wouldn't have postured if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons. So I'm not arguing for them to have nuclear weapons. I'm just simply saying they trusted the wider free world to have guaranteed them, and they haven't stepped up to those guarantees. So there is some issues. I keep coming back, peace with justice. Taking off their nuclear weapons was great, but it did leave them rather exposed, and that exposure wasn't guaranteed to be protected by the Western powers.
I mean, what would it take to get UK boots on the ground in Ukraine?
I don't think we'll be putting boots on the ground. If you're talking about peacekeeping or something else, maybe a different matter. But my view is that keep coming back to this, you need to have a peace that is durable and has some justice in it, which is never easy, but it needs both sides to want to do that. And I don't get any inclination of President Putin that he wants to do this because he thinks he's going to take over Ukraine. And so we now wait carefully for President Trump to indicate where he's going. I have a sense of where he might go, but the important thing is that he comes to the conclusion. And that's the one thing that President Xi in China, which is a really powerful country and very worrying, or Putin, where he is now, it's where will Trump go with this? And that, I think, will be an important feature.
there does seem to be an alliance forming between countries like Russia. I mean, they signed a protection pact with Iran and North Korea. That's a bit worrying.
I call it the new axis of totalitarian states. I've been banging on about it now for 2, maybe 3 years. I said what we are seeing.
How does it feel to be right?
Well, I don't know. Nobody else seems to think so. But, I've been banging on about it for some time to say that we have to be careful now because nothing is done now haphazardly or by individuals. It's coordinated. So I argued, for example, that at a time when Russia was under pressure, things hadn't gone right, and the Ukraine was wanting to mount some kind of offensive. They just didn't have the weaponry that was necessary for it. And then you look carefully at what happens in the Middle East. Iran is part of that axis: North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. Don't forget you got Myanmar as well involved in it. And Syria was part of that, but they've gone now. So why in heaven's name did Hamas attack Israel in such a brutal fashion? Up until then, they'd never quite done it on the scale they did it. And I still remain convinced that they did it because it was to provoke Israel and thus take the attention of the United States away from Ukraine, which it duly did. As I went out there to see the Republicans about it, and they said, "This is not our war, Ukraine. It's Taiwan and the Middle East and the survival of Israel." And so these things are not by accident because Iran was working through proxies, and they're the ones that order the shots with the proxies. And it was successful because it did exactly that. Although now you can see that Israel was tough on it.
That's interesting that Republicans say it's not their war because, all through the 90s and the early 2000s, it was Bush who first proposed that Ukraine even join NATO. So I'm curious, how can Republicans be sort of led to, the trough in terms of supporting Ukraine? I mean,
well, let's not get it wrong. America has stepped up and done a lot of support. So I'm by no means critical of America for doing that. The bill that was going through at the time, not this year, but December of 23, had been stopped for some time. And it wasn't a perfect bill. I think over 60 billion was involved in it, but some of that money was going to the wall and various other bits and pieces. Sure. And there was lots of stuff that Republicans didn't agree with. So stepping back from that for a second, it was stayed for some time because of resistance in the House of Representatives. So I went out there with one or two of my colleagues in the Conservative Party. We were asked to go out there and talk to them about what we thought was at stake. And many of them said, look, Ukraine isn't our problem, it's Europe's. Europe should do all this. And there's a fair comment on that, although Europe had stepped up and was beginning to pay a lot of money, but there's more they could do. But the point they made was our issues are what's happening in Palestine, in Israel, and Taiwan, and the threat by China to take Taiwan. And they said, Ukraine is your war, it's Europe's war. I did actually then point out to them that this, in fact, is the wrong way to look at it. You should look at the axis of totalitarian states that has been forming in front of us and know that all of these things are coordinated. And therefore, this is coordinated to take the pressure off Russia, which it duly will do. And I said, you should see this in strategic terms. In strategic terms, the real power you have to look at is China. And China calls the shots now in that axis. They have the money. And they make us dependent on them for our products. We've been rather stupid about that. We've not really thought it carefully through. So China itself is very strong in the support for Russia and has been very close to Iran. You can see the strings that travel from Beijing outwards. And my point is, look at it like that and then ask yourself the question, what if Ukraine goes down? What happens next? Taiwan is next. And they will be emboldened by our failure to defend any kind of democracy, any kind of rational country that wishes to be a member of the free world. We abandon them or we don't do enough. And that is like repeating history in the 1930s. And if we want to do that, then the victor isn't just Russia, but it is ultimately China. And I think China poses the most significant threat that we've seen since the Cold War.
And now you're personally sanctioned by China.
Yeah.
You are in charge of or the committee that is involved with sanctions, correct?
Well, I'm chairing of an all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky sanctions.
Okay, which are explained
Bill
to us.
Browder was involved in as well.
Yes.
So Magnitsky sanctions were passed because of his lawyer Magnitsky, who was arrested in Russia. He had fled and was tortured and died in prison. And Bill started this idea that, in fact, what we do get wrong with sanctions is we make big sanctions. But he said, the way to do this, and he's right, is to go after people as individuals, so they can't hide behind government policy. If they were responsible for that, then you go after them as individuals and you sanction them, which is very difficult then, because lots of these oligarchs and potentates and people, they love to come to Western markets and shop in the smart, shops in the very smart cities and enjoy their nightclubs and all their other stuff that they do in expensive hotels. But if they're sanctioned, they can't do that. And that hurts. And the second thing it does is it means that they then start maybe saying to others, well, we don't really want this, do we? Why are we doing this? Why do I have to have the sanctions on me? So sanctioning individuals has an effect, and it's been demonstrated to do so. But we don't do enough of it.
Yeah.
So I would be very keen for us to be sanctioning a lot more people from different states that we think are a bit too authoritarian.
Anyone in particular?
I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of people we will get to. And I think whilst we've sanctioned lots of people as a result of the invasion, there's still many more that are kicking around and evading sanctions like mad. And there are other countries too that do brutal things. And I think it's time for us to face up to the fact that you need to deal with them.
So you're here in Ukraine.
Indeed.
Why are you here?
Well, come and do this interview, I think. Wasn't that the whole plan? No, I'm here because I want to understand better where Ukraine is, what's happening, what Ukraine needs, to go and ask for that, and to get a sense of where Ukraine is in terms of the war, and then try and take that back. And I brought two other members of parliament from two different parties. I've done that before, and I think that's important. And try and remind Parliament that this is a war on our doorstep, and the outcome of which will affect our lives for years to come. Now, the first time you came here, you and I went on a very interesting trip. Oh, yeah. I was lucky enough to go on it with you. And we traveled in these. We did. They're Canadian vehicles that were loaned to the Ukrainian army because they thought it would be a good way to test them. Really? These are armored personnel carriers. So basically, when you're in them, what can't hit you? Generally, they're quite good against small arms fire. Yeah. But I wouldn't like to be hit by a rocket or an artillery shell. No, probably not. And you were wearing body armor, as I recall. It was my first time wearing body armor. And I've worn it a few times since for a couple of United 24 reports. But I think I have a picture of you in the body armor. You haven't got it here. I do. I have it here, but I have it. Well, we were just about 2.5 kilometers from the Russian border. Yeah, we were, exactly right, yeah. We'd gone to visit that area, and we went to the villages that had been vacated by the Russians, and I have to tell you, it had a really big effect on me. Yeah. I mean, the devastation they wrought and left behind, and I was told that the bodies were littered all over the places that we had been to. They'd been cleared up by then, but the places were still worryingly mined. And these are not wealthy towns, by the way, compared to the West. These are very poor villages. Yeah. But when the Russians ransacked them, many of them were Eastern Russian troops. And these were wealthy villages for them. And they took all sorts of stuff out, which was terrible, really. So it's appalling. This was November or early December 2022. I mean, I don't think many members of parliament were coming, 2.5 kilometers from the Russian border at that time. Did you get any flack for that? No. It was quite good, though, because I was able to say, look, we need to understand better what happens. It's not a war via television. It's a war when you get on the ground and you see the devastation. You have to be affected by it. You have to say, we've got to stop this. We've got to find a way. War is bad and terrible at the best of times. Anybody who's ever served knows that war is the last thing you ever wish on anybody, because those who are innocents get killed possibly more than those who are combatants. So walking around there was really a moment for me when I saw the way they'd left those towns and villages and realized that actually Russia was behaving in a bestial manner.
And this was the picture of us.
There she is.
And there is, I mean, you can see a sniper.
Church got a hole. Why do you fire at churches? What is that all about?
Yeah.
So these are the wonderful people from, as you were one of them, from what was then Siobhan's Trust, has now become to Helpful. Hopeful. I should have got that right.
But we are helpful as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the kilts are designed by David Fox Pitt, who set up this charity and drove down when everything was in chaos and has gone to the front to cheer people up, feeding pizzas to people, which it may seem surprising, but I think it's a peculiarly British way of dealing with people who are suffering, is to come and cheer them up. And yes, you come and help them and aid them and work with them. But mostly when you see the faces of the little children in the freezing cold coming up and getting a pizza when they don't even have a house that is able to be heated or hot water that we take for granted, it's really quite moving. And the kilts were designed by him, and they are, of course, blue and yellow. So they are, in fact, Ukrainian kilts.
The spirit of Ukraine.
Ukraine may not know it, but they have kilts. And the body armor there was being modeled by you.
Now, you support Hopeful through the Center for Social Justice, is that right? That's one of your many.
We gave them an award a year ago, I think it was, and we constantly direct anybody that's interested towards them. I set the CSJ. It works with small community groups and charities all over the country, UK.
Yeah.
But also we do stuff for countries, charities in different countries as well. And this was one that we deemed to be one of our overseas charities that year.
Because it's interesting because you, as you know, in your political career, you can be quite hawkish. You described yourself as sort of both sides, or sort of like how they feel about you. That you're quite committed to issues. I think so.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you go through politics and you have to decide where you stand. Sometimes you're more often probably with your government, but not necessarily so. I've rebelled against my government. I've done lots of things really in politics. You get it right sometimes, you get it wrong at other times. We're all just human really, I suppose. But you try and do your best, and I think the key focus is how do you improve things? How do you make things better? Not everybody will agree with me. Some will be screaming at the screen right now. But my comment is you do your best. But you also have this sort of activist side to you, which and also a softer side, feeding this dog. Yes, that was a stray dog we found in one of the villages, and I happened to, surprisingly, have some dog biscuits because I've got a couple of dogs, and this thing looked so skinny and I don't know whether it would survive or not. I had about 3 or 4 biscuits, and it was very worried about us, tentative, and I just whistled to it a couple of times and held out a biscuit, and bit by bit, came and ate the biscuits. And then as we walked away, I thought to myself, gosh, I wonder if that'll make it through the winter. I thought the same. The poor people that are living in hovels. In thinking about freedom, what would you say to the people in Ukraine? Well, hang on, really, is all you could say to them at the moment. Hang on, and hope that people from countries like the UK and America and others can boldly state your case, and to bring common sense to the free world, to recognize that this is not an isolated incident. This has been building for a while we've been busy sending signals to China and to the Russians and to others that we basically lack the moral fiber to stay the course when we support countries that are struggling to be democracies, to overcome corruption, and to try and re-enter the world of freedom, the rule of law, etc. And it's the reason I'm here. It's the reason why many of those who come with me are here. It's the reason why the charity is here helping. It's the reason why a lot of British people still raise money for it. Iain, thank you so much. My pleasure. My pleasure.